You think you're clean? Japan might disagree. Not because Japanese people are somehow cleaner than everyone else, and definitely not because Westerners are dirty. The difference is more interesting than that. Japan and the West often draw the line between clean and unclean in completely different places. There are things most of us in the West do every single day without giving them a second thought. We wear our shoes a little farther into the house. We blow our nose when we need to. We put on perfume before going out. We take a long bath and assume we're getting cleaner the longer we sit there. None of that feels strange to us. But in Japan, some of those same habits can make people quietly uncomfortable. And once you understand why, you start realizing that Japanese cleanliness isn't just about removing dirt, it's about boundaries. Where does the outside world end and your home begin? Where does something personal stop being personal and start affecting the people around you? That's the question running through all 7 habits we're about to look at. And some of them are probably going to surprise you. Number 3 has almost nothing to do with whether something smells good. It's about what happens when your personal scent becomes part of somebody else's space. Number 5 completely flips the Western idea of what a bath is actually for. Number 6 reveals one of the biggest everyday bathroom differences between Japan and the United States, something so normal in Japan that many Americans don't realize how unusual their own routine looks from the other side. And number 7? It's tiny. It takes maybe half a second. Most people at the table won't say a word if you get it wrong. But in Japan, that little gesture can say a surprising amount about whether you're thinking only about yourself or about everyone sharing the space with you. So as we go through these 7 habits, don't think of this as a list of strange Japanese rules. Think of it as a different map of cleanliness. Because by the end, you may realize that Japan isn't really asking, "Are you clean?" It's asking something a little more uncomfortable. What happens to everyone else when you're done? Before we get into the first habit, there's one idea that makes almost everything else in this video easier to understand. In Japan, cleanliness has never been only about whether something looks dirty. There's also the question of where that impurity belongs, and whether it crosses into a space where it shouldn't. One old Japanese concept that helps explain this is kegare. Kegare is often translated as impurity or pollution. And in Shinto tradition, purification called harai is the act of removing that impurity and restoring a sense of order. Now, you don't need to know anything about Shinto to understand modern Japanese life. But once you start paying attention, you can still see echoes of this way of thinking in surprisingly ordinary places: at the front door, in the bathroom, on a crowded train, at the dinner table. And there's a simple way to think about it. Outside, body, shared space. Those 3 zones explain a lot. Something that has been outside doesn't automatically belong inside your home. Something that comes from your body may be perfectly natural, but that doesn't mean it belongs in a shared public space. And something you personally enjoy, a smell, a sound, even the way you eat, can become a different issue once everyone around you has to experience it too. That's the part many visitors miss at first. In the West, we often think of cleanliness as something we deal with after the fact. The floor gets dirty, so we clean it. Something smells, so we cover it. We make a mess, then we remove the mess. Japan often approaches the problem one step earlier. How do you stop the dirt from entering in the first place? How do you keep something private from becoming public? How do you prevent your personal habits from becoming somebody else's inconvenience? That's the map I want you to keep in your head as we go through these 7 habits: outside, body, shared space. Because what looks like 7 unrelated rules is really one idea showing up again and again. Cleanliness isn't only about cleaning up afterward. Sometimes It's about noticing the boundary before you cross it. And the first boundary is probably the most visible one in Japan. It begins the moment you walk through the front door. Number 1. Wearing outdoor shoes inside the house. This one sounds obvious once you think about it, but most of us don't really think about it. Imagine where your shoes have been just since this morning. A parking lot, a sidewalk, the floor of a grocery store, maybe a gas station, maybe a public restroom, maybe a train platform or a bus. Your shoes quietly collect a little bit of every place you walk through. Dust, mud, tiny bits of debris, whatever was on the floor before you got there. And then, in many Western homes, those same shoes keep going across the kitchen, across the living room, across the carpet, sometimes right past the couch, the dining table, or the place where children play on the floor. In Japan, that entire chain is usually stopped at the front door. That's what the genkan is for. The genkan is the entryway in a Japanese home, usually set slightly lower than the main floor. It's not just a convenient place to leave your shoes. It's a boundary. Outside ends here. Inside begins there. Once you step up into the home, the outdoor shoes stay behind. And that makes more sense when you understand how Japanese floors are actually used. People sit on them. Children play on them. People kneel on tatami. Futons may be laid close to the floor. So, the floor isn't treated like something that only the bottom of your shoes touches. It's part of the living space. And Japan often takes that idea even one step further. In some homes and traditional accommodations, there are separate slippers just for the toilet. You wear your indoor slippers through the house, change into toilet slippers in the bathroom area, and then change back when you leave. At first, that can feel incredibly specific. But there's a logic behind it. Japan doesn't always divide the world into only two categories, clean and dirty. There can be layers: street outside, home inside, bathroom inside the home. Each space has its own boundary. And once you see that, the shoe rule stops feeling like a random Japanese custom. It's really a prevention system. The idea isn't, let the dirt come inside and we'll clean it later. It's, why bring it inside at all? That's an important difference. A lot of Western cleaning habits begin after something gets dirty. The Japanese approach here begins one step earlier. Stop the transfer before it happens. Leave the street at the door. And once you understand that boundary, the next habit gets even more interesting. Because sometimes the thing crossing into shared space isn't on your shoes. Sometimes it comes from your own body. Number 2, blowing your nose in public. This one surprises a lot of Western visitors because, in some ways, the social rule feels completely backwards. In the United States, most of us grow up hearing some version of the same lesson. Don't sit there sniffling. Grab a tissue, blow your nose quietly, take care of it, and move on. To us, that can feel like the polite thing to do. In Japan, the situation can be very different. Blowing your nose loudly or noticeably in a public place can make the people around you uncomfortable, especially in close shared spaces like trains, restaurants, or crowded waiting areas. Instead, many people will sniff quietly and wait until they can find a more private place to deal with it. And if you've never experienced that before, it can be confusing. Imagine you're standing on a crowded train in Tokyo during allergy season. You hear someone sniffing to your left, then someone else behind you, then another person across the aisle. After a few minutes, you might start thinking, why doesn't somebody just blow their nose? So you decide to do what seems polite back home. You reach into your pocket, pull out a tissue, turn your head slightly, and blow your nose. From your point of view, you've solved the problem. You're not sniffling anymore. But from another cultural point of view, You've just taken something private and made it public. The sound is public. The action is visible. And something coming from your body is now being handled in a space everyone else has to share. That's where the Japanese idea of meiwaku helps make sense of the difference. Meiwaku is often used to describe causing inconvenience, burden, or discomfort to other people. And in everyday Japanese life, avoiding unnecessary meiwaku can matter a lot. That doesn't mean natural bodily functions are considered shameful. They're normal. The question is where you deal with them. And that's the important shift. The behavior itself isn't always the problem. The location can completely change what that behavior means. What feels considerate in one culture can feel intrusive in another. And this brings us back to the map we talked about earlier. Body, shared space. The moment something from your body enters a space that everyone else has to experience, the social rules can change. Once you start noticing that, a lot of Japanese etiquette makes more sense. And the next habit pushes that idea even further. Because sometimes you don't have to touch anyone, make a mess, or even make a sound to enter somebody else's space. Sometimes all it takes is a smell. Number 3, wearing too much perfume or cologne. In the West, fragrance is often personal. It's part of how you present yourself. A certain perfume can feel elegant. A certain cologne can make you feel more confident. Some people even think of scent almost like a signature. You walk into a room and people know you're there before you've said a word. In Japan, that can be exactly where the problem begins. Japanese social norms generally tend to favor lighter, more restrained scents, especially in places where people are packed close together. A train, an office, an elevator, a restaurant. Because once a scent leaves your body, it doesn't stay personal anymore. Everyone around you experiences it too, and that's where this gets interesting. Your perfume may be your personal choice, but is smelling it everyone else's choice? Imagine stepping into a small elevator with 10 strangers. You chose your fragrance that morning. You chose how much to put on. But the other 10 people? They didn't choose any of it. They can't turn it down. They can't step away. And for the next 30 seconds, your personal preference becomes part of their environment. That's a very Japanese way of looking at strong scent. Not simply, does this smell good? But, how far does this smell travel? In discussions about workplace etiquette in Japan, you may even hear the term sumahara, or smell harassment, used for odors that become uncomfortable or intrusive for the people around you. And that doesn't only mean bad body odor. It can include strong perfume, heavy cologne, scented hair products, or even fabric softener that lingers in a shared space. The point isn't that fragrance is forbidden, it's that restraint matters. A scent that stays close to you is one thing. A scent that arrives before you do and remains after you leave is something else. Think of smell almost like sound. You may love the song playing through your headphones, but if everyone on the train can hear it, it's no longer only your experience. Scent works the same way. Once it leaves your personal space, it becomes part of everyone else's sensory space too. And that's the deeper shift here. In the West, fragrance is often treated as self-expression. In Japan, the question can become, how much of my self-expression should everyone around me be required to experience? That's a very different way to think about perfume, and it brings us back to the same principle we've already seen. Your body, your choice, shared space. The moment those three overlap, consideration starts to matter. And the next habit takes that same idea out of the elevator and onto the street. Because in Japan, even something as ordinary as eating a sandwich while walking can say more than you might expect. Number 4, eating while walking. This one is so normal in the United States that most of us barely notice we're doing it. Coffee in one hand, phone in the other, maybe a breakfast sandwich you're trying to finish before the next meeting. You eat while walking to work. You drink while crossing the parking lot. You grab something on the way to the train because stopping feels like wasting time. In a lot of Western cities, that doesn't look rude. It looks efficient, busy, productive. In Japan, the same habit can be viewed very differently. There's even a word you'll often hear connected to it, taberuki. It literally refers to eating while walking. And in many everyday public settings, especially crowded streets, doing that can be considered poor manners. Not because eating outdoors is automatically wrong. That's an important distinction. Japan has plenty of street food. Festivals are full of it. Markets are full of it. Food stalls, temple approaches, tourist areas, and designated eating spaces can all be places where eating outside feels completely normal. So the rule is not, never eat outside in Japan. The better rule is, pay attention to the context. And once you look at the practical side, that starts to make sense. Imagine walking through a crowded street with a cup of coffee in one hand and food in the other. Someone suddenly stops in front of you. You bump into them. Coffee spills. Sauce gets on someone's jacket. A wrapper slips out of your hand. Now you've turned your lunch into somebody else's problem. And there's another detail visitors notice pretty quickly in Japan. Public trash cans can be surprisingly hard to find. So, if you eat something while moving, the cup, wrapper, skewer, or napkin doesn't just disappear when you're finished. It stays with you. You're responsible for it until you find the proper place to throw it away. Kamakura is a good example of how seriously this kind of shared space etiquette can be taken. The city has actively encouraged visitors to avoid eating while walking in crowded tourist areas, not because street food itself is the enemy, but because spills, litter, congestion, and careless behavior can affect everyone using the same street. But I think there's another layer here that's easy to miss. In many Japanese settings, eating isn't treated as just a way to get calories into your body as efficiently as possible. There's also value in actually stopping, looking at the food, tasting it, giving the meal a little attention. That may sound simple, but think about how often we do the opposite. We eat while answering messages. We eat while driving. We eat while walking. Sometimes we finish an entire meal and barely remember what it tasted like. Japan doesn't completely reject that modern pace, but it often leaves more room for the idea that eating deserves its own moment. So the deeper lesson here isn't, don't walk with food. It's this. Where are you eating? Who is sharing that space with you? And are you paying enough attention to avoid making your convenience somebody else's inconvenience? Japan doesn't only ask, what are you eating? It also asks, where are you eating it? And who has to share that space with you? And the next habit takes this idea of separation even further. Because in Japan, even the place where you wash your body is divided into two very different jobs. One is for getting clean. The other is for something else entirely. Number 5, washing yourself in the bathwater. This is where the Japanese idea of cleanliness really starts to feel completely different from the Western one. In the United States, a bathtub usually does two jobs at the same time. You get in dirty, you wash your body, and then you stay in the same water to relax. Soap, shampoo, body oils, sweat, whatever came off your skin, all of it ends up in the bath with you. And most of us never think twice about it. That's just what taking a bath means. In Japan, the logic is almost the exact opposite. The bath, the ofuro, is not where you go to wash yourself. It's where you go after you've already washed yourself. That's the part many first-time visitors don't expect. Before entering the tub, you wash your body outside it. You use soap. You clean yourself thoroughly. Then you rinse every bit of soap away. Only after you're clean do you step into the hot bath. Wash, rinse, soak. That order matters. And once you understand it, something else about Japanese bathing suddenly makes sense. In many Japanese homes, more than one family member may use the same bathwater. At first, that can sound strange to someone from the West. But the Japanese bath isn't supposed to collect everyone's dirt. Everyone enters after washing. The water is there for soaking, for warming the body, for relaxing, for slowing down at the end of the day. And that same logic carries over into the onsen, Japan's hot spring baths. If you've never been to one, this is one rule you really want to know before you go. You don't walk straight into the shared bath. First, you sit at the washing area. You wash. You rinse yourself completely. Then, you enter the water. Because in Japan, you don't enter the bath to become clean. You enter because you are already clean. That's the reversal. And I think there's something surprisingly beautiful about it. Cleaning and bathing are treated as two different experiences. One is practical. The other is restorative. Clean first, restore second. One removes the day from your body. The other helps remove the day from your mind. And suddenly, the Japanese bath starts to feel less like a giant container of hot water and more like the final step in a ritual. First, remove what you don't want to carry with you. Then stop, warm up, and let your body settle. So if you ever visit a Japanese home, ryokan, or onsen, remember 3 simple words: wash, rinse, soak. It will keep you from making one of the most obvious bathing mistakes a visitor can make. But the next habit may be even more surprising. Because after using the bathroom, Japan asks another very simple question. If water is what you trust to clean the rest of your body, why would this part be any different? Number 6, using toilet paper alone. Now we get to one of the biggest everyday bathroom differences between Japan and the United States. And the interesting part isn't really the technology, it's the expectation behind it. In Japan, bidet-style toilets are everywhere. Homes, hotels, office buildings, train stations, shopping centers, even plenty of ordinary public restrooms. For many first-time visitors, the toilet itself can feel almost futuristic. Heated seats, water pressure controls, temperature settings, different wash functions. Sometimes there are so many buttons that using the bathroom feels like operating a small control panel. But for most Japanese people, the point isn't that it's futuristic. It's that washing with water has become normal. Toto introduced the washlet in 1980, and over the decades, it went from a novelty to something found in the large majority of Japanese households. The original script's figures put adoption at around 80% of multi-person households in Japan, while bidet-equipped toilets remain far less common in the United States. That gap is interesting, but the more revealing question is why the gap exists at all. Think about it this way. If you got something unpleasant on your hand, would you wipe it several times with dry paper and then say, "Good enough?" Probably not. You'd use water, maybe soap. Then you'd feel clean. That's basically the logic behind the Japanese approach. Paper is useful. Paper removes material. But water actually washes. And once you get used to that distinction, relying on dry paper alone can start to feel strangely incomplete. That's why the most interesting thing about the washlet isn't the heated seat. It isn't the buttons. It isn't even the technology. It's the assumption built into the whole system. Cleaning should mean removing something, not simply moving it around. That's a pattern we've already seen in this video. Don't bring street dirt deep into the house and clean it later. Stop it at the genkan. Don't enter shared bathwater carrying the day's sweat and soap. Wash first. And here, the same principle shows up again. Remove contamination instead of redistributing it. What many American visitors experience as a luxury feature is often treated in Japan more like ordinary hygiene infrastructure, not something you use because you're fancy. Something you use because that's what a toilet is expected to do, and that's what makes the difference so revealing. The machine itself isn't really the story. The standard is. Japan looked at a routine most of us perform without thinking and asked a very simple question. If water is what we trust, when we really want something clean, why would we stop using it here? And the final habit is much smaller than a washlet. No electronics, no buttons, no technology at all. Just a pair of chopsticks. And one tiny decision that can tell the entire table whether you're thinking about yourself or everyone else. Number 7, using your personal chopsticks in a shared dish. This one is easy to miss because nothing dramatic happens. No one stops the meal. No one points at you. Most of the time, nobody says anything at all. But at a Japanese table, that tiny movement can still mean something. Imagine you're eating with a group. There's a large plate in the middle of the table. You take a bite with your chopsticks. Then, a few seconds later, you reach back into the shared dish with the same end that was just in your mouth. In Japan, that practice is often referred to as jikabashi. And the hygiene logic is pretty simple. Mouth, chopsticks, shared dish, other people. The issue isn't the chopsticks themselves. It's whether the end going into the shared food has already been in your mouth. That's why shared meals often come with separate serving chopsticks, called toribashi. Those are the chopsticks meant to move food from the communal plate to your own dish. Use the serving chopsticks, then eat with your personal pair. It sounds like a tiny difference, and it is. It takes maybe 1 second. But that's exactly why I think this habit says so much. Using the serving chopsticks says, I remembered this food belongs to all of us, not just me. You don't have to make a speech. You don't have to announce that you're being considerate. The gesture does it for you. And that brings us back to something we've been seeing throughout this entire video. The shoes weren't really just about shoes. They were about the shared floor. Blowing your nose wasn't only about your nose. It was about what happens in a shared public environment. Perfume wasn't only about whether you liked the smell. It was about shared sensory space. Eating while walking wasn't only about food. It was about how your convenience affects a shared street. The bath wasn't only about getting clean. It was about keeping shared water clean. The washlet wasn't really about technology. It was about removing contamination instead of simply moving it around. And now the chopsticks aren't really about chopsticks. They're about a shared meal. Different objects, different situations. Same question. Where does my personal habit stop being only mine? That's what makes this last example so powerful. Because the action is almost invisible. You reach for the serving chopsticks. It takes a second, maybe less. But in that second, you're acknowledging something important. There are other people here. Their comfort matters too. And once you see that pattern, all 7 habits stop looking like random Japanese rules. They start looking like different versions of the same idea. And that idea is what ties this entire list together. And now that we've gone through all 7, something becomes pretty clear. At first, these habits looked completely unrelated. Shoes, blowing your nose, perfume, eating while walking, bathwater, toilet paper, chopsticks. 7 different situations, 7 different rules. But they're really 7 versions of the same idea. Japanese cleanliness is often less about being obsessed with cleaning and more about controlling transfer. Where does the dirt go? Where does the smell go? Where does something from your body go? And once it leaves your personal space, who else has to deal with it? That's the pattern. It's not just about keeping yourself clean. It's about preventing your mess from becoming someone else's. And once you start looking at it that way, a lot of these habits become easier to understand. Taking your shoes off isn't only about having a cleaner floor. It's about stopping the outside world before it travels deeper into the home. Keeping fragrance subtle isn't only about personal taste. It's about recognizing that smell doesn't stay inside your personal space. Washing before entering the bath isn't only about your own body. It's about protecting water that other people may share. Using serving chopsticks isn't really about etiquette for the sake of etiquette. It's about remembering that the food in the middle of the table belongs to everyone. Different habit, same principle. So, here's a simple way to test almost any everyday habit through that lens. 3 questions. First, does it spread? Does what I'm doing stay with me? Or does it travel into the space around me? Second, does it transfer? Am I actually removing the dirt, smell, or contamination, or am I simply moving it from one place to another? And third, does it impose? If the people sharing this space had a choice, would they choose to experience what I'm doing? The smell, the mess, the sound, the contact. That's a surprisingly useful question, because shoes, perfume, bathwater, and chopsticks may look like completely different things, but underneath them is the same awareness. Notice where your space ends and where someone else's begins. And I think that's the part of Japanese cleanliness that's easiest to miss. From the outside, it can look strict, detailed, maybe even excessive. But underneath many of these habits is a very ordinary idea. Other people are here too. Their comfort matters too. Their space matters too. And sometimes being clean isn't about scrubbing harder, buying more products, or spending more time cleaning. Sometimes it's just about stopping for half a second before your habit crosses into somebody else's world. So now I'm curious. Which of these 7 surprised you the most? Comment the number below. And tell me this too. Do you think the Japanese approach makes sense? Or do you think some of these habits go a little too far? I'd genuinely like to know where you draw the line. Because maybe cleanliness isn't only about what we remove from ourselves. Maybe it's also about what we choose not to leave for someone else.